June 8th, 793. You're standing on the windswept shore of a small tidal island off the northeast coast of England, Lindisfarne.
A famously grim day.
Right. For decades, this monastery has been this, this beacon of quiet contemplation.
Yeah.
Scholarly pursuit. And then you see the sails.
Square, massive sails cresting the horizon.
Exactly. And within hours, the sanctuary is just completely shattered. Monks are slaughtered in the nave. Their bodies are thrown into the freezing sea to drown. Secret altars are literally dug up and smashed apart for their gold.
It was a profound shock to the system.
Yeah, I mean, the Northumbrian scholar Alcuin of York later wrote about it, saying, never before in Britain has such a terror appeared. And if you look at pop culture, the explanation for this violence is usually pretty simple, right?
Giant, bearded barbarians just consumed by innate bloodlust.
Right. But what if the real reason those monks died was actually because of an agricultural boom deep in the Norwegian mountains?
Or, a shift in the silver trade routes winding through the Abbasid Caliphate thousands of miles away.
Exactly. So today, we are not talking about the blood. And we are certainly not talking about horned helmets.
Which didn't exist, by the way.
No, absolutely not. We're talking about the invisible gears of a massive historical machine.
Because it is so easy to fall into that trap of the simplified barbarian trope. But historical events of this magnitude, they just don't spontaneously generate from pure aggression.
Right. And that is why we are here. You, listening right now, you're a student of medieval European history.
Yep.
You want to look past the myths.
You're looking for the underlying mechanics.
Exactly. So our mission today for this deep dive is highly specific. We are going to explore, dissect, and interrogate the distinct scholarly models that attempt to explain why the Viking Age occurred in the first place.
And we're working from a really comprehensive synthesis of the major historiographical debates on this.
Yeah, we're breaking down the demographic, economic, political, ideological, and technological gears that all locked into place at the end of the 8th century. But before we get into the models, we kind of need to fix the timeline, don't we?
We really do. Because to do this properly, we have to start by completely reevaluating when this all started. Lindisfarne is a dramatic starting pistol that everyone learns in school.
Right, 793, boom, Vikings.
Exactly. But the scholarly consensus has actually shifted dramatically in recent years. Historians like Judith Jesch, for example, they point to a wealth of archaeological evidence that pushes the timeline way back.
Wait, like what kind of evidence?
Well, things like reindeer antler combs from Norway that were found in the marketplace of Ribe in Denmark.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this suggests established systemic contact and travel across the region as early as 700 to 750 AD.
So the sack of Lindisfarne wasn't the first contact at all?
Not at all.
It was just the loudest, like the most shocking one to the literate Christian world because they wrote it down.
Precisely. The earliest raids were likely really small, incremental, and highly localized. And to understand this explosion of Scandinavian activity, we cannot look at the Nordic countries in a vacuum.
Right, they aren't isolated.
No, we have to view Scandinavia as a periphery that's reacting to massive, sweeping changes happening across the entirety of early medieval society.
From, like, the explosive growth of the Islamic world in the east to the expansion of the Frankish Empire in the west.
Exactly. It's a highly connected world.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we want to find the root cause of why tens of thousands of Norsemen suddenly left their fjords and farms to raid, trade, and settle across half the known globe, let's start with the most basic human question.
Did they simply run out of room?
Right. Let's talk about the demographics. Too many people, or just a cliche?
Well, the demographic model was, for generations of historians, the absolute go-to explanation.
It makes intuitive sense, right?
It does, and the premise is rooted deeply in the harsh geography of Scandinavia itself. If you look at the Skandes, the massive mountain range running through the Scandinavian peninsula.
It's basically all rock.
Yeah, Norway, for example, is incredibly mountainous. Even today, only about 3% of its land is arable.
3%. I mean, that is a razor-thin margin for survival in an agrarian society.
It really is. So the theory posits that a localized population explosion in these difficult terrains essentially pushed people out to sea.
Because they couldn't feed everyone?
Right. And the catalyst for this population boom was, ironically, a huge technological leap.
The proliferation of iron.
Exactly.
Let's drill into the mechanics of that, because I think people hear iron and they think of swords and axes for warfare. But the real revolution was in the dirt, wasn't it? We're talking about bog iron.
Yes, bog iron is crucial here. Scandinavia is very rich in peat bogs, and beneath those bogs you find these pea-sized nodules of iron oxide.
Just sitting there in the mud.
Just sitting there. And the Norse became incredibly adept at harvesting and smelting this bog iron. So suddenly you have a society transitioning from softer metals or even wooden implements to very durable, plentiful iron tools.
I mean, when you put an iron tip on a plow, everything changes. You can cut through the dense, rocky, root-choked soil of a Norwegian valley that was previously completely unfarmable.
Yeah, and you get better axes to clear the old-growth pine forests, which leads to a direct chain reaction.
Better tools mean expanded farming.
Expanded farming means increased agricultural yields. More food means better winter survival rates, fewer children dying in infancy, and ultimately longer lifespans.
But paradoxically, because that carrying capacity is strictly capped at that 3% of arable land we talked about, this agricultural success story turns into a societal pressure cooker.
Exactly. You can only terrace so far up a mountain before the frost just kills your crops.
Right.
And this is exactly where the historian Robert Ferguson enters the debate. He argues that this specific demographic growth created an incredibly volatile generation.
Because of the social structure.
Right. In early medieval Scandinavia, land ownership was the absolute foundation of wealth, legal rights, and social standing. If you didn't own land, you were essentially a non-entity. Yeah, and suddenly you have an entire generation of younger sons who find themselves with no inheritance, no property, and consequently no status.
Because of the inheritance laws, right. If a farmer has 5 sons surviving to adulthood instead of just 1, he can't just chop a tiny valley farm into 5 pieces.
No, the plots would be too small to feed a single family. They'd all starve.
Precisely. So Ferguson's argument is that these landless, disenfranchised young men needed a way to make a living and secure their social standing.
And to remedy this lack of property, they turned outward. They turned to piracy to gain the material wealth that they were denied by birth order and geography.
And as this population continued to swell, these fleets of younger sons looked further and further beyond the Baltic Sea, eventually just spilling out into the North Sea and down the rivers of Europe.
That's the traditional demographic model in a nutshell.
Okay, I have to push back on this a little bit.
Go for it.
Wait, just having too many people doesn't automatically mean you build fleets of highly advanced warships and invade the Kingdom of Wessex.
That is a very fair point.
If you were just feeling the squeeze of too many neighbors, why not just migrate slowly into neighboring uninhabited forests? Why not adapt locally?
Right, why go to all the trouble of crossing an ocean?
Exactly. It's like saying a crowded city inevitably produces a syndicate of international pirates instead of just, building taller apartment buildings. Do we really buy that crowding alone magically creates a sophisticated maritime invasion force?
Well, that pushback is exactly where modern scholarship has taken the debate. And it raises a really critical point about demographic determinism.
Okay.
James H. Barrett is a key scholar who has thoroughly interrogated this model. Barrett acknowledges the data, right? Scandinavia absolutely experienced demographic growth.
But
he points out that this was part of a broader pan-European population expansion at the end of the first millennium. There were more people everywhere, from Francia to Anglo-Saxon England.
Oh, right, because the warming climate and better farming techniques were happening everywhere, not just in Norway.
Exactly. So Barrett dismisses population pressure as a realistic primary cause of the Viking Age. Simply being crowded does not organically bestow upon you the complex navigational knowledge, the military organization, or the specific motivation to sail across the lethal open waters of the North Sea.
Sphere-Bag takes a slightly different angle on this too, right? He looked at the cultural framework.
He does. Bagg examines the settlement data and agrees the population was rising. But he notes that a fundamentally warlike, honor-based culture does not strictly need the excuse of population pressure to resort to plundering abroad.
They just need a target.
Yeah. For Bagg, population increase was a contributing factor, sure. It provided the raw manpower, the bodies to fill the boats, but it wasn't the spark.
And then you have Anders Winroth, who just entirely obliterates the premise.
Winroth does not mince words. He claims that the entire overpopulation thesis is, quote, simply repeating an ancient cliche that has no basis in fact.
Wow.
Yeah, he argues that medieval societies had numerous ways of absorbing population growth without resorting to international pillaging.
A cliche. That is a brilliant way to reframe it.
Yeah.
Because if raw starvation and overcrowding weren't the primary engines pushing them out, We have to stop looking at the Scandinavian mountains and start looking at what was pulling them in.
Right. What was the draw?
Where was the wealth? How did shifts in the broader medieval economy create this irresistible magnet for Norsemen?
Which seamlessly transitions us into the economic realities of the era, the economic model.
This is one of my favorites.
It's fascinating. It posits that the Viking expansion was fundamentally a reaction to growing urbanism and shifting trade routes throughout mainland Europe and the East.
So following the money?
Exactly. The world beyond their borders was getting exponentially richer, and that wealth was becoming highly concentrated.
We really have to zoom out here and look at the globe, because the growth of the Islamic world is a massive, often under-discussed factor in the Viking Age.
Oh, it's absolutely pivotal.
In the 8th century, the Abbasid Caliphate establishes its capital in Baghdad. And you have an incredibly sophisticated, incredibly wealthy empire minting millions of silver dirhams.
Mountains of silver.
And as their trade routes expanded northward through the Caspian Sea, up the Volga and Dnieper rivers, they created this riverine superhighway of wealth.
And the Scandinavians, specifically the Swedes, who navigated these eastern river systems, they tapped directly into that.
What were they trading?
They traded furs, amber, and tragically human slaves captured from Slavic lands, all in exchange for this Islamic silver.
But the wealth wasn't just in the east.
Yeah.
What was happening in Western Europe?
Yeah.
Because they hit the West hard, too.
Right. In the West, we are looking at an era historians often call the Long 8th Century. Following centuries of post-Roman economic stagnation, Western Europe began experiencing a period of notable prosperity.
The boom time.
Yeah. And the absolute loudest indicator of this prosperity was the explosion of proto-urban trading centers.
The witch towns.
Yes, the witch town.
I'm obsessed with this detail. If you look at a map of Anglo-Saxon England or the Frisian coast, you see these names everywhere. Ipswich, Londonwicket, Eoforwick, which becomes York, and places like Dorestad on the continent.
They pop up very quickly.
But wait, what actually is a Lisswich town from an economic standpoint? Like, how did they function day to day?
Well, a witch town, or an emporium, was a newly established, dedicated trading settlement, usually situated on a navigable river near the coast. And unlike the old Roman walled cities, which were built for military defense and administration, these witch towns were built entirely for commerce.
Ah, so they weren't fortresses.
Not at all. They were bustling, muddy, incredibly wealthy hubs where merchants from across Europe came to trade wine, glass, pottery, and textiles.
And crucially, because they were built for commerce rather than war, they were largely undefended. They were open marketplaces.
Completely exposed.
So you have the Scandinavians, who are already adept at coastal navigation and regional trade in the Baltic. They see these booming, wealthy, unfortified towns sprouting up along the coasts of Britain and Francia. It's like a neon sign flashing free silver.
It really is. And the physical evidence for this influx of wealth is staggering. We aren't just relying on written accounts of trade here. We can pull the proof straight out of the ground.
You're talking about the hordes.
I am. Take the Cordale hoard or the Vale of York hoard found in England.
Describe what is actually in those hordes, because it taints such a vivid picture of this economy.
Well, the Cordale hoard, discovered in Lancashire, contains over 8,600 items. We are talking about 40 kilograms of silver.
Just buried in the dirt.
Buried in a lead chest. But it's not just local Anglo-Saxon coins. That's the amazing part. It is full of Carolingian coins from Francia, Kufic dirhams from the Islamic world, and massive amounts of hack silver.
Hack silver. I love that term. That's when they literally chop up jewelry, right?
Exactly. Silver arm rings and brooches that were literally chopped into pieces with an axe to be weighed out on scales for transactions. It represents a completely globalized bullion economy flowing directly into Scandinavian hands.
It's like the early days of globalized supply chains.
Yeah.
When a massive new market opens up, entrepreneurs just flock to it.
Right.
You have this river of silver flowing from Baghdad up through Russia. You have wealthy, undefended trading hubs in England, and the Norse position themselves right in the middle as the ultimate middlemen, sometimes trading, sometimes taking.
A very thin line between merchant and pirate.
Very thin. But I have a major timeline question here.
Sure.
Does this highly integrated economic model hold up for the very earliest raids? If we look back at Lindisfarne in 793, those massive, humming global trade routes weren't fully established yet, were they?
You've hit on the exact nuance that James H. Barrett uses to modify this economic model. Barrett rejects the idea that a perfectly integrated, globalized economy sparked the initial Viking expansion.
Because it doesn't fit the map.
Right. He points out a glaring geographic inconsistency. The very first recorded Viking raids occurred between western Norway and northern Britain, places like Lindisfarne and Iona in Scotland.
Isolated monastic communities, nowhere near London or York.
Exactly. And Barrett notes that these specific areas were not highly economically integrated. They were completely outside the main hubs of this new globalized witch-town trade network.
Ah.
So you cannot really argue that the Norse were drawn by globalized urban trade if their very first targets were isolated religious outposts on the fringes of the trading world.
Okay, so how does Barrett explain the economic motive then, if it wasn't just pure global trade pulling them in?
He proposes a concept known as the youth bulge.
Wait, isn't that just the demographic model all over again, the overpopulation theory we just spent time debunking?
It sounds identical on the surface, but the underlying mechanism is entirely different.
How so?
The demographic model says the land is starving us, we must leave to survive. Barrett's youth bulge theory says we have plenty of food to survive, but we have a sudden demographic spike of young men who have zero economic upward mobility at home.
Oh, they aren't starving. They are ambitious and they are bored.
Precisely. It is the lethal combination of a large cohort of young men with limited economic alternatives in Scandinavia suddenly becoming aware of massive economic incentives just across the water.
Right.
A youth bulge combined with the knowledge that portable wealth, silver chalices, gold crosses, exists in undefended monasteries, gives these young men overwhelming incentives to take to the sea. Staying home offered them nothing. Taking a ship offered them everything.
Okay, that makes total sense on an individual level. You have a bunch of ambitious young guys who want to get rich and elevate their status. But a bunch of guys wanting silver is just a mob.
True.
A mob does not organically organize into the great heathen army that systematically conquered half of England. They don't build coordinated fleets of hundreds of ships by accident.
No, they certainly do not.
The difference between a mob and a military campaign is leadership. Who was organizing these men? What was happening with their rulers back home?
And that brings us squarely into the political model. And this model is fascinating because it forces us to look at a dual engine of push and pull.
Let's start with the push.
Right, let's start with the internal push. Right at the dawn of the Viking Age, Scandinavia was undergoing a brutal, painful centralization of power.
Let's set the scene there. Because before this centralization, the sources describe a highly fragmented landscape, right?
Very fragmented. In Norway alone, the mountainous terrain and deep fjords naturally divided the land. By the year 800, you had dozens upon dozens of small, independent petty kingdoms and local chieftains just ruling their own isolated valleys.
But then you see the rise of ambitious warlords.
Yes. Emerging dynasties attempting to appropriate land and forge larger national identities in Denmark, Sweden, and especially Norway. The prime, vivid example of this is King Harald Fairhair.
Harald Fairhair is such a cinematic figure. The sagas say he made a vow not to cut or comb his hair until he had conquered all of Norway, right?
That's the legend, yeah. And his campaign to fulfill that vow was relentless and incredibly violent. Culminating around the year 872 at the Battle of Hafrsfjord, Harald systematically crushed the resistance of the petty kings.
You just steamrolled them.
He really did. He confiscated their ancestral lands, imposed heavy taxes, and violently displaced hundreds of independent chieftains who refused to submit to his absolute rule.
Okay, put yourself in the shoes of one of those defeated chieftains. You've just lost your land, your power, your ancestral home. Wouldn't you just retreat up into the mountains, gather your loyal retainers, and fight a bitter, protracted guerrilla war?
That would be the traditional move.
Yeah, why pack up your entire life, load your family and your livestock onto a boat, and move to a freezing, damp island in the North Atlantic to start over?
Because they didn't view it as start over, they viewed it as a tactical retreat. What is so fascinating is that they did continue the Civil War.
Wait, really?
Yes. They fled across the sea to the Scottish Isles, the Hebrides, the Orkneys, the Shetlands, and from those islands, they didn't just quietly settle down to farm sheep. They used them as fortified maritime bases to launch endless, devastating counter-raids back against King Harald in Norway.
Oh, wow. So they were essentially running a government in exile. They didn't abandon the fight. They just relocated their base of operations completely beyond Harald's immediate reach.
They were a massive thorn in his side. Harald actually had to organize a massive royal fleet and sail all the way to Scotland around 875 just to subdue these rebel exiles who were harrying his coasts.
That's incredible.
So the internal political strife of Scandinavia directly exported highly trained, heavily armed, extremely angry men into the North Atlantic.
But they didn't just spend all their time looking over their shoulders at Norway. They also looked outward at the rest of Europe. And that is the pull factor of the political model, right? They looked around and saw a continent dealing with its own massive political failures.
Yes. The complete vulnerability of their neighbors. Let's look at Britain. You didn't have a united England at this point. You had the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy.
7 different kingdoms.
Mercia, Wessex, Northumbria, East Anglia, and so on. Constantly warring with each other, trapped in a state of internal disarray and political backstabbing. They were entirely distracted.
And the situation on the continent was even more consequential, because everything changes in January 814.
The death of Charlemagne.
Right. While Charlemagne was alive, the Frankish Empire was a superpower. It was centralized, it was heavily militarized, and it was fiercely defended.
He kept the borders very tight.
The Norsemen knew better than to provoke him directly. But after his death, the empire passes to his son, Louis the Pious, and eventually the whole empire splinters.
It does. You get the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which literally carves the Frankish Empire into 3 separate, squabbling kingdoms for Charlemagne's grandsons.
And the centralized military response just evaporates.
Poof. Gone. The Franks are too busy fighting each other to guard their coasts.
And the Vikings exploit that power vacuum with surgical precision. They realized they could sail up a French river, sack a wealthy town, and retreat back to the ocean weeks before any decentralized, slow-moving local lord could muster an army to respond.
Anders Winroth emphasizes this heavily. He argues forcefully that the Viking Age was propelled by the purposeful choices of shrewd political actors.
Not just random raiding.
No, these displaced warlords and ambitious chieftains weren't a mindless swarm. They were playing a highly sophisticated geopolitical game in a rapidly destabilizing medieval landscape.
It's pure, ruthless strategy. Hitting an undefended monastery makes perfect economic and political sense for a warlord looking to fund his retinue. It is low risk, high reward.
Very high reward.
But I keep coming back to Lindisfarne and Iona.
Right.
The violence against the church was so specific, so visceral. They didn't just steal the silver chalices. They slaughtered the priests and desecrated the altars. Was it just a robbery? Or is there a deeper, darker reason the Vikings targeted the Christian church so aggressively?
That is a very pointed question.
Which brings us to our next framework, the ideological model.
This model completely shifts our focus from economics and statecraft to religion and worldview. To understand the ideological friction, we have to look really closely at the geopolitical borders of the late 8th century. The famous sack of Lindisfarne in 793 does not happen in a vacuum. It coincides almost exactly with Charlemagne's Saxon Wars.
And we really need to be clear about what the Saxon Wars were, because these were not minor border skirmishes or like polite diplomatic disputes.
And far from it.
The Saxon Wars were brutal. Decades-long campaigns of forced Christianization and conquest against the pagan Saxon peoples who lived right on the southern border of Denmark. Charlemagne was aggressively expanding his empire and his religion by the sword.
And the violence was systemic. In 772, Charlemagne destroyed the Irminsul.
That was the sacred pagan pillar, right?
Yes, a pillar central to Saxon religion. And in 782, you have the Massacre of Verdun, where Charlemagne ordered the beheading of 4,500 captive Saxons who had rebelled under their leader, Widukind.
4,500 beheadings in a single day.
Yes.
I mean, if you were a pagan Dane living just north of the border, watching the smoke rise from Saxon villages, watching refugees pour across the frontier, telling stories of a Christian emperor who executes thousands for refusing baptism, you are terrified.
You are terrified and you are enraged.
This is exactly the foundation of the historian Bruno Dumézil's theory. Dumézil posits that the early Viking attacks may have been a direct, retaliatory response to this aggressive, violent spread of Christianity.
The Scandinavian pagans felt the suffocating tension of the Frankish Empire right on their doorstep.
It wasn't abstract to them.
Not at all. The Danes even expanded the Danevirke, a massive system of defensive earthworks across the neck of the Jutland Peninsula, specifically to keep the Christians out.
So what does this all mean? It's almost like Newton's third law applied to medieval geopolitics.
Oh, how so?
Well, Every aggressive expansion of an empire and its religion creates an equal and opposite violent reaction from the borderlands.
That's a great way to look at it.
The Norsemen couldn't attack Charlemagne's armies directly, right?
Yeah.
They would be slaughtered. So they struck at the ideological symbol of that encroaching empire, the undefended Christian monasteries across the sea in Britain.
It is a deeply compelling lens through which to view the visceral nature of the violence. They were striking at the god of their enemy. And this penetration of Christianity remained a massive ideological threat. It eventually caused immense internal strife within Scandinavia itself.
Centuries later, even.
Yeah, a century later, you see kings like Olav the Holy in Norway using extreme violence, torture, maiming, and execution to force his own people to convert.
Right, which culminated in civil wars.
Exactly. And battles like Stiklestad in 1030, the ideological clash was very real and very bloody.
Okay, so we have ambitious young men looking for silver, we have displaced warlords seeking new bases, and furious pagans pushing back against an encroaching Christian empire.
A potent mix.
But here is the massive, unavoidable roadblock. It does not matter how angry you are about the Saxon Wars. It does not matter how much you want Islamic silver. It does not matter how politically disenfranchised you are.
What's the roadblock?
If the North Atlantic is choked with pack ice and hammered by endless, unpredictable winter gales, you cannot sustain a maritime invasion. You will drown.
Which introduces an incredible invisible variable into our diagnostic landscape. The climate.
Yes. Let's talk about the sky above them, because the environment plays a huge role.
It does. Right around the year 800, overlapping perfectly with the onset of the Viking Age, the Northern Hemisphere enters a climatic phenomenon known as the medieval warm period.
The temperatures just ticked up.
Average temperatures rose significantly.
And the effects of this cannot be overstated. It provided incredibly stable, predictable weather patterns. The seas were calmer. Crucially, sea ice retreated dramatically further north.
This is absolute magic for maritime travel.
Right. It meant a longer sailing season. It meant the colonization of distant, isolated landmasses like the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland.
And eventually the staggering voyage to Newfoundland in North America. All of that actually became viable.
Furthermore, the warmer climate boosted those agricultural yields we talked about earlier. Good harvests meant they could actually provision these massive fleets for long voyages.
The climate physically permitted the expansion.
Which is the perfect bridge, because the climate is just the stage. It clears the ice, but you still need the vehicle.
You need the boats.
Exactly. It didn't matter how warm the water was if they didn't have a way to cross it safely and quickly. Everything, literally every single model we have discussed today, hinges entirely on the technology.
And this brings us to the technological catalyst.
The big one.
Simply put, this model suggests the Viking Age occurred primarily because of a revolutionary leap in engineering. Now, piracy and maritime warfare existed in the Baltic for centuries before the 800s. People have always fought in boats.
Sure.
But the Norse developed a suite of technologies that made long-distance, open-ocean raids possible in a way the world had never seen.
The ships are the absolute superstars of this era. But before we talk about how they were used, explain the anatomy, because these weren't just big rowboats. There was a massive leap in sailing technology, right?
Oh, absolutely. The adoption of the large, broad, square sail was game-changing. But the true mastery was in the rigging. They developed advanced tacking practices.
Tacking, meaning sailing into the wind.
Right. Using specialized spars, they could angle the sail to catch the wind even when it wasn't blowing directly from behind them. They could effectively sail upwind.
Which is incredibly hard to do with a square sail.
It is. Coupled with advanced navigational techniques, using sun shadows, observing bird migrations, and reading wave patterns, they could engage in 24-hour sailing, navigating over the open ocean out of sight of land for days on end.
But the real masterpiece, the defining physical object of the Viking Age, is the clinker-built longship. Wait, before we sail this thing up a river, what does clinker-built actually mean from an engineering standpoint? How is it different from the ships the Romans or the Franks were building?
It is a totally different philosophy of shipbuilding.
Yeah.
The Romans built skeleton first. They built a rigid wooden frame and then nailed planks flush against each other. It made a heavy, rigid ship.
Like a tank.
Yeah. The Norse built clinker style. They laid the keel first and then attached long oak planks that literally overlapped each other at the edges, like the shingles on a roof.
Oh, interesting.
They fastened these overlapping planks together with iron rivets and caulked the gaps with tarred animal hair or wool.
What does that overlapping construction actually do for the ship in the water. Why is it better?
It makes the hull incredibly strong, but more importantly, it makes it flexible. A rigid Roman ship gets battered by the massive, turbulent waves of the North Sea. A clinker-built longship literally twists and flexes with the waves. It glides over them rather than fighting them.
And they were fast. The sleek aerodynamic profile allowed them to reach an estimated maximum speed of 14 to 15 knots.
Which is flying on the water back then.
But the most terrifying aspect of the longship wasn't its speed on the open ocean, it was its draft.
Exactly. The draft, meaning how deep the ship sits in the water, was incredibly shallow. A massive longship carrying 60 heavily armed warriors might draw only 3 feet of water.
3 feet?
Yes.
I mean, that is the ultimate asymmetric advantage. It meant they didn't need to conquer a deep water port to launch an invasion. They could execute highly efficient hit-and-run attacks.
Anywhere there was a beach.
They could just run the ship straight up onto any flat, sandy beach, deploy a shock troop of warriors instantly, and then physically push the ship back off the sand and disappear before the local militia could even saddle their horses.
And it meant their threat radius was not restricted to the coastlines. Because of that shallow draft, they could sail far inland, navigating incredibly shallow river valleys.
And this leads to some massive historical events.
It does. One of the most famous examples of this is the Siege of Paris in 845. The legendary chieftain Ragnar Lothbrok led a fleet of 120 ships right up the River Seine.
Just imagine the psychological terror of that. You're living in Paris, hundreds of miles from the ocean, you feel completely insulated from naval threats, and suddenly a fleet of Viking warships sails right into the heart of your city.
It completely bypassed traditional static land defenses.
Anders Winroth sums this up with absolute clarity, doesn't he?
He really does. He writes, quote, "If early medieval Scandinavians had not become exquisite shipwrights, there would have been no Vikings and no Viking Age." The technology literally created the era. Without the clinker-built ship, the ambitious young men stay home. The displaced warlords have nowhere to flee. The silver stays in the markets.
Which brings me back to my getaway car metaphor from earlier. Did the ship invent the Viking, or did the Viking invent the ship? Did they build these engineering marvels specifically because they wanted to raid Europe?
The evidence leans heavily toward peaceful necessity, actually. Remember the geography of Norway? Towering mountains and impassable fjords?
Right, overland travel was a nightmare.
Exactly. The sea was simply the easiest and often the only way for neighboring communities to communicate, trade, and survive. The Norse were already uniquely adept maritime engineers out of sheer geographic necessity.
So the technology evolved organically, first for trade and then.
Yes. For conducting bulk trade and carrying heavy cargo like walrus ivory or timber, they developed the Nar, which was wider, deeper in draft, and relied almost entirely on its sail.
But then things escalated.
But as political tensions rose, they adapted those shipbuilding techniques to create the specialized military longship. Longer, narrower, packed with oarsmen for speed and maneuverability in battle.
Speaking of battle, how did they actually fight at sea? Because you don't really hear about massive naval bombardments or ramming tactics like the ancient Greeks used.
Well, naval battles in the open ocean were actually quite rare. The ships were too valuable and the ocean was too dangerous. But when fleet engagements did happen, usually in the sheltered waters of a fjord, the tactics were brutal.
What did they do?
Viking crews would literally rope all their nearby ships together, gunwale to gunwale, creating a massive floating wooden platform.
Wait, really? So they essentially turned a naval battle into a land battle on the water?
Exactly. They would slowly row this massive platform toward the enemy fleet, hurling spears, stones, and arrows as they closed the distance. Then they would engage in vicious hand-to-hand melee combat, attempting to board and clear the enemy decks.
It's a great tactic for maintaining a unified front, but it completely removes your ability to maneuver. If the battle turns against you, a single ship can't easily retreat without cutting the ropes and breaking the entire formation.
True, but strategically, the mobility of the individual longship remained unmatched for nearly 3 centuries.
So how did it end then?
It wasn't until European armies and navies radically adapted their own military architecture that the Viking advantage was neutralized.
So the rest of Europe finally caught up.
They did. In the 11th and 12th centuries, you see the proliferation of stone castles that couldn't be easily raided. At sea, the Europeans began building cogs, which were ships with raised, fortified platforms called castles fore and aft.
Oh, like a literal floating castle.
Right. This allowed Christian archers to stand high above the low-riding longships and rain arrows down into them. That vertical advantage eventually spelled the end of the Viking ship's dominance.
But for almost 300 years, those clinker-built ships were the ultimate skeleton key to Europe's wealth.
They unlocked the world.
Which brings us to the end of our diagnostic journey today. As a student of history, the absolute greatest takeaway you can pull from this deep dive is the extreme danger of the single-cause fallacy.
Absolutely.
We all want the easy answer. We want to point to a textbook and say, the Vikings expanded because of an iron plow population boom, or because of the Abbasid silver trade, or because of Charlemagne's beheadings.
But the reality of history is never a single, clean fracture line. It is a complex, overlapping constellation of symptoms.
Right.
The Viking Age wasn't just about landless young men, or greedy kings consolidating power, or religious trauma, or a brilliant piece of woodworking.
It was a perfect storm. It was the exact singular moment in time where all these gears locked together. The demographic pressures of a growing population, the global economic shifts bringing Islamic silver north.
The brutal political centralization at home pushing exiles out, while the fragmentation of the Frankish Empire pulled them in.
The visceral ideological clash on the borderlands, a warming climate that cleared the ice, and the revolutionary maritime technology that made the oceans navigable.
They all intersected at the end of the 8th century to ignite a phenomenon that fundamentally reshaped the globe.
It really is staggering when you lay it all out like that.
And as you continue your studies, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've talked about how perfectly these factors aligned, but imagine if just one of them had been missing.
Okay.
Consider the ideological model. If Charlemagne hadn't aggressively pushed Christianity to the borders of Scandinavia with fire and sword, if he hadn't created that massive ideological terror, would the technological brilliance of the ships and the economic lure of the silver have simply led to a massive, peaceful Scandinavian trading empire?
Wow.
Were the Vikings made by their own innate ambition, or were they fundamentally forged by the immense violent pressures of the changing medieval world around them?
That completely changes how you look at the map. You might never get the simple, clean answer, but understanding the intricate complexity of that muddy historical landscape is so much more rewarding. Keep digging into your sources, keep questioning those ancient cliches, and we will see you on the next deep dive.